Welcome everyone, bienvenidos todos. My name is Sofia Hinojosa and I'm a research analyst in the Health Policy Center at the Urban Institute. Before we begin today's conversation, I first want to quickly go over some housekeeping items. We have live Spanish and Portuguese interpretation for today's conversation. To listen to the conversation in either language, please click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen, which is a globe icon, and select the language you prefer to listen in. Hoy contamos con traducción en español y en portugués. Para acceder a ella, por favor hagan clic en el botón de acceso en su pantalla en forma de globo. This event is being recorded and the recording will be posted online afterwards. Closed captioning is enabled. You can adjust the setting with the caption buttons. Speaker biographies are available online at urban.org, and Haley will drop a link to the speaker biographies on the chat box. All participants are muted, but you can type your questions and comments in the Q&A box at any time. We kindly ask if you can please take 1 to 2 minutes to complete a survey at the end of the event. And lastly, engage with us online by using #live@urban. I now want to introduce my colleague, Luisa Godínez Puig, a senior research associate at Urban.
Thank you so much, Sofia. Welcome, everyone. Bienvenidos todos. My name is Luisa Godínez Puig. I'm a senior research associate and equity scholar at Urban Institute. And I am so delighted to be here today with a fantastic trio of panelists. I welcome our panelists to come on camera now. But before we start talking to them, I want to talk a little bit about what we will do today. We will talk about the importance and the role of Latino museums and cultural institutions in advancing cultural equity. But very importantly, we see this conversation as a great opportunity to celebrate our diverse and rich Latino heritage and cultures. We are joined today by Celina Barrios Milner, co-vice president of the Office of Race and Equity Research here at Urban Institute. Patricia Lanes, museum program consultant, cultures and literacies through art in the 21st century. And Laura Huerta Migus, deputy director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I want to first open the floor to my colleague here at Urban, Sofia Hinojosa, to talk briefly about the role of Urban in informing the American Latino History and Culture program at the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Sofia, on to you.
Thank you, Luisa. It is a pleasure to be here, especially among such fantastic panelists. Let me give a quick overview of the American Latino History and Culture program, ALCH for short, which was spearheaded by the Institute of Museums and Library Services. After briefly talking about the project, I then want to take the opportunity to set the conversation on what cultural equity means in this context. In 2020, Congress enacted legislation to establish a new American Latino History and Culture program at the Institute of Museums and Library Services. The ALCH program was meant to use grant making to strengthen the capacity and impacts of American Latino museums nationwide. At Urban, we were delighted to be called to help. For the past 14 months, researchers at the Urban Institute helped inform the ALCH program in multiple ways. Urban's team was guided by the following objectives. 1, to inform the design of the ALCH program to reflect cultural literacy about American Latino institutions and the communities they serve. 2, to identify the universe of existing and potential American Latino museums. 3, to develop priorities for IMLS and implementing the ALCH program to build applicant capacity, assets, and address needs. 4, to clarify ways IMLS could capitalize on existing federal endowment, program, grant, and regulatory models. And 5, to support IMLS in preparing for the ALCH program's evidence building, performance measurements, and evaluation. For this project, Urban identified 270 museums across the country that reflect a wide range of museum types. We are excited to be wrapping up our findings soon in a report that is set to be published by the end of this year, along with other publications, so stay tuned for that. The legislation that established this program's purpose aims to, and I quote, illuminate the story of the United States for the benefit of all by featuring Latino contributions. To us, this is very reminiscent of the importance of cultural equity, which embodies the values, policies, and practice that ensures that all people, including Latinos, are represented in the development of art policies, museums, and cultural centers, the support of artists, curators, and others, and the nurturing of accessible and thriving venues for expression. At Urban, we know that supporting Latino museums across the United States is vital to preserving and promoting American Latino art, culture, and history, which is why we are so excited to hear from our panelists today. And I will pass the mic back to Luisa to start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Sophia, for such a great overview. I would love to start the conversation today with a bit of a personal question to get to know our panelists a bit better. So if it's okay, I will start with you, Laura, and I would love for you to share more about your current role and what motivated you to enter the museum space.
Thank you, Luisa, and hello everyone online. Buenos días todavía. Es mañana in California, where I am, but I know we have people across the country. Thank you for that question. I think I'll start with where I am now, which is as the Deputy Director for the Office of Museum Services at IMLS. And IMLS is the federal government's largest funder of libraries, archives, and museums in the United States. And our museum office disseminates a little over $53 million in competitive grants to museums, which we can talk about as we have a very broad definition of museums and related institutions every year. And it's a real honor to be in that seat, which I've been in since 2001. But it's been a little over a 20-year pathway to this position, advocating for museums and within the museum community, specifically about equitable practices. And where I come from there is actually coming from inspiration for the woman who's sitting in the room outside here, my mother, who is a bilingual elementary school teacher for many years in San Antonio, Texas. And I grew up watching her in the classroom and watching her be an advocate for the value of all of the cultural knowledge and language skills that we already come with, and how important that was for ensuring the success of the students that she was teaching every day on the west side of San Antonio. And so I come to that advocacy very honestly. She made sure that my sister and I were bilingual in a time where that was very rare for Chicanas of our generation to be fully bilingual because of how important that cultural knowledge was and that pride was going to be to take us through our lives. So I pursued that all through college and university, and then there's a long story that ends in Washington, D.C., looking to be an advocate for multicultural education. And I found myself in the museum field, starting with children's museums. And I found that that was going to be my space. This was an incredible opportunity to be in community spaces. And children's museums tend to be some of the more grassroots, also museum organizations that are started by women for and in service to children. And that's really been my motivator in this field for 25 years, to really lift up and empower and accelerate those practices that set museums up as the spaces for negotiating educational equity that we think they can do. So that's how I got here.
That is fascinating, and I love how you uplifted the value of all the cultural heritage that we come with and from, and really the importance of being bilingual and celebrating our cultures, as well as the role of museums as community spaces, especially kids' museums, which I completely agree with you. I would love to turn now to you, Patricia, and ask a very similar question. Could you share with us a little bit more about your role and what motivated you to enter the museum space?
Okay, thank you, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. Great honor. And I hope I can do justice. So this is very emotional. You know, my motivation, I'll start with my motivation and then I'll finish with my role. By my motivation, we arrived as a family of immigrants, Latinos. At that point, I was Patricia Lanes, Uruguaya, a family of 3 kids, trying to figure out what on earth is America, what on earth is the US, and what are we doing? Are we doing the right thing? So the first thing, and because of the kind of background that I was coming from, my thing was my work in museums and everything is tied to my identity as an immigrant and also as a speaker of Spanish. You know, that is my main, not my main, but those are very strong parts of my identity. And what happened was at the beginning, I was going to museums with the kids. We arrived in the summer, there was no school, and just trying to figure out, okay, what on earth do Americans value? You know, what do because that was the lens I was going to, you know, it was my thing. But it was interesting because it was not only what was hanging, how people behaved, you know, what were the kind of programs, languages that were happening, how my kids were reacting or not. And also, but it also gave me an outsider lens. You know, it was like me as an outsider trying to figure out, okay, what is this country about? But then, you know, I start immersing myself more and I start being labeled you Latinas or you people of color. And it was like, oh my God, people are seeing me as a Latina. So that's a really strong trait that for me, it was like, okay, I'm an immigrant, I'm a Spanish speaker, whatever. So that's when I started exploring, you know, what did it mean to be a Latina in the US and what kind of connotations came with that? You know, were they good? Were they bad? Were they just things that people say because they say it? So what I realized, then I went into museum work and started working a lot because of the language, also skills that I had. They would ask me, well, can you take this group? Or I started working in communities that were Latinas. And, you know, at the beginning, trying to bring Latino audiences, you can't bring Latino audiences if you're not part of that community. So we started working a lot with the Latino communities and with the students. And what I realized was that what was happening at the museum, it was a space that was safe, families trusted, the kids trusted. It was like a place where they could go and speak and nobody was correcting them. And it's what Laura said, and Luisa, you said before, the background knowledge and background experiences were like a leveling thing. You know, it's not that you don't know this or that, but it is that because I was working and I work a lot with art museums and I love the power of art, you know, for engaging people in conversations that bring them sometimes not even noticing, but it's like that convergence of multiple knowledge systems and multiple ways of seeing the world and everybody engaging in a conversation and you're doing it through the artwork. So it's not even dangerous in a sense, you know, it's like you're not saying, no, it's like you're channeling in the artwork. So that was how I ended up, you know, really focusing. And then, you know, when I go to my first AAM conference in whatever it was, 1,000 years ago, there was a Latino group and I was lost. And it was like all these people from all over the country. I didn't know anyone. And when I heard Spanish, and then I see there's a Latino network, forget it. I never left it until AAM canceled the networks, you know, the affinity networks. But that was my entry. And then it's like, it became like an equity issue also, you know, about the possibilities, about the, and moving away from that deficit model that I could see pervasive, oh, we are going to help, you know, how can we help? Forget it. You know, it's so it became a lot my role. I see myself as a community builder, as a connector, as a facilitator, an advocate and a pusher. You know, it's like, okay, we're going to do this. You know, if I can open my mouth, and I see also I'm in a position of privilege of trying to bring multiple narratives to conversations and to spaces. So, and it's, you know, Latino is one of my focuses, but I can see, you know, any community that has many times been left aside or haven't found themselves in museums, they, you know, there's a purpose in there to make the space. So how can we do it so that the museum becomes a civic space, a space where we all go, you know, and participate in a democratic process? And so I don't know if I went.
No, that was fantastic. I really empathize with you and what you said about your work in museums being tied to your identity as an immigrant and as a speaker of Spanish, and really departing yourself and your work from the deficit model. And that's so true. My own work on equity here in the US is always informed by my own lived experience, by my identity, by the languages I speak. And I really try to make it a celebration of our cultures and not so much you know, focusing on the deficits. And I do believe that makes it stronger. Selena, now I want to turn to you, and I have a very similar question as well. I know you have been very active in the equity space, and I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about your current role here at Urban and what motivated you to enter this equity space.
Thank you so much, Luisa. And it's such a privilege to be here with you all and my co-panelists, Laura and Patricia. I really appreciated hearing about your work and your journey here. At the Office of Race and Equity Research, we work to center race and equity across the work that the Urban Institute is doing across all of the policy areas that we work in. And we also work internally to build the capacity of our colleagues to center race and equity in their work. And so I come to this work from a lifetime of equity work that's been called different things at different times. It started, I think, when as an immigrant from Venezuela, I moved here like Patricia, but I was one of the kids. I wasn't the mom. So my mom brought us here when I was just in first grade, and we moved from Caracas, Venezuela, where everyone in my family had been for many generations, and they were all in the same city, all in the same neighborhood, to Cincinnati, Ohio, where even in September I was cold, you know, and little did I know what was coming. And that experience, both of the abrupt change from being part of the mainstream to being different, the like every time I filled out a test, it was like black, white, and other, right? So it was like literally you are an other. I quickly understood that they didn't expect me at this party, that you know I didn't get an invitation to the party, and that a lot of other people like me and also different from me also weren't invited. And so I really dedicated my life to helping make sure people were included and felt included. And that journey has taken many shapes. I've been mostly what I identify as a community organizer and someone that helps create spaces for people to be actors and the protagonists of their own stories, and have worked a lot in immigrant rights, have worked a lot in political representation, helping people of color win historic firsts mostly in Boston, Massachusetts, where I'm now based, but also at the national level and state levels. And now I look at my current role as taking some of what I've learned along the way, but also my real passion is learning from others and learning what's working in different cities, in different neighborhoods, in different communities, and sharing it across the country, because there's so much great work happening and so many great people doing it that I'm really passionate about connecting that work across. So I'm really happy to be here today and feel just so excited that not only that there's this initiative around the museum, which like I couldn't have dreamt of that when I first came to this country, but also just to have this conversation today with the folks that are here.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think your comment on realizing that you went from being part of the mainstream to not being part of the mainstream was so powerful and really resonated with me. But I particularly love that that's what informed your work as a community organizer. And it really seems like for all three of you, you have very, very personal ties to the important roles that you take on. And I truly believe that that's one of the beauties of our community. I think we are very passionate people and very passionate about advancing the well-being of our people from our own different spaces and unique spaces. And I really love that. I will pass the mic to my co-moderator, Sophia, now, and she will ask a few more questions.
Thank you so much, Luisa, and for all the insightful and rich responses we've been hearing so far from our panelists, and excited to ask more questions. I'm going to switch up the order a bit. So I have a question prepared for Patricia. Patricia, you mentioned earlier about your personal connection to your profession. Could you expand a little more on what Latino culture means to you? And I know it's a big question, so feel free to interpret it however you like. You're on mute, Patricia.
Sorry. Big is small, you know, it's very big. It's very big, and it's very complex, and it's rich. You know, it's how do we define Latino culture? Can you do it just like in terms of one definition? I don't think so. You know, it depends on who you are, where you're coming from. But there are some common things that I think that I realized when I moved to the US, and then I started exploring what is this thing of being Latino. It was the lack of I never know how to pronounce it, homogeneity, but at the same time, there were traits underneath that lied among, you know, we would open our mouth and we knew we were speaking the same language. And I'm not talking about Spanish, it was like the metaphorical thing. And so for me, you know, in my own case, it's who I am, but I think it is as a culture, if you look at it as a culture, it's like that complexity. And, you know, and I hear many times Americans say, let's keep it simple, let's keep it simple. We can't leave it simple. You know, we need to address all those layers. We need to see how it affects, you know, what you understand by your culture and how we put them in dialogue. And I think that that's why, and perhaps I'm going off, but, you know, I see museums as spaces of memories, of stories, of encuentros, of places where you gather, of you belong, and ownership. And it's like, for Latino culture, you know, it can be a way of getting us together when we are speaking the same language many times, even, you know, if we bring Portuguese into the picture, but it's that complexity that makes it so rich, I think. And it's complexity in everything. And that's why many times, you know, that all this idea of intersectionality, that it's something that perhaps it's a lens that we have to keep in mind when we're looking at Latino culture, and how does that affect the definition of it? You know, it's like, and not to always see it as a, you know, subjugation, or as a group that's left aside and not integrated. So I always say, let's complicate the complexity. You know, it's like, let's keep it complex. And I guess, you know, it might not answer your question, I don't know. It's a complicated one. But
Let's-
it's a rich one, you know, and I think that's what attracts people to Latinos, because the more you explore, but you know, all cultures are complex and rich. So it's like, the thing is, how do we keep that, you know, and what's a space for museums to do that?
Laura, I
Maybe,
see that you're, oh, sorry.
yeah,
Yeah, go
Sophia,
for
if I
it.
could jump in a little bit, because I think Patricia, and I think it's also to think about Latino cultures. That's the thing about being Latino, Latina, Latine, Latinx, like, is that it has always been an existence of complexity, where many, let's say, Northern, Western European cultures are about linear thinking and concrete thinking. I'm going to go to my anthropologist training, my ethnographer training, which is something that I pursued because I needed to understand myself in a world that didn't match. My home did not match what TV was telling me was an American experience, even though this is the tierra that my people are from. I think complexity is one of them. We have things that tie us together as some shared historical dynamics of conquest, of immigration, of acculturation, because, you know, Selena, Patricia, Luisa, Sofia, all of us, if we looked and did our, you know, our 23andMe's, are probably going to have very, very different generational paths to this identity, right? But it's still here. And so I think, to me, that's one of the beautiful things about this work that's getting enabled by this program, and that especially for in museums, is that there's never going to be a bottom or an end to stories and lifting layers of our cultures and experiences. You know, people don't, I think about just, you know, I'm Mexican American, and that's the tradition I come from. And who are some of the most well-known female creatives from Mexico? Frida Kahlo, Hungarian. Salma Hayek, Lebanese. And then as an author, for me, Elena Poniatowska is Polish. Okay, so, but they're all Mexican and they're Tiro Mexicanas. And so that is the kind of, for me, when I think about what the culture means or what the cultures mean, is that beautiful, complex dynamic is at the core of it, you know, which I think is so beautiful. It can resist being reduced.
Thank you both for sharing. That really resonated with me. When I first learned about this project at Urban, I was so excited to participate and to have the opportunity to uplift our complexity, our nuances, our intersectionality, and the beauty of all our cultures and heritages. And in that vein, I want to direct my question to Selena, and I would love to ask you, why do you think spotlighting Latino culture is important?
Thank you so much. You know, I think that throughout my work in the field of social justice and equity, there's been one thread that's rang true, which is, you know, in order to achieve equity, you have to not just look at providing opportunities, but also what are the outcomes of those opportunities. So it's not just like making sure everyone knows about the meeting, right? But then, like, who shows up and who speaks at the community planning meeting, or whatever it is. I come from a local government context mostly. And so it is about everybody having a space, but in order for everyone to have a voice, to be represented, to have agency, the interventions that are needed for each individual community are customized. Like that's why, you know, when we think of equity, it's not equality, right? It's not the same thing for everybody. So equity also requires that we focus on specific communities and center specific communities in order to make sure that that they're represented. And I think that that's the part that makes this work really important. And I think, you know, to what Laura so eloquently pointed out, there's not one Latino culture, right? Even within Mexico, right? Like the example she gave, there's so many different cultures, you know, within this country. The Latino experience and Latino art and Latino history are very different. You know, there's the immigrant context, there's regional context, there's the intersection of indigeneity and African ancestry as well, that I think, you know, that sometimes leads to the erasure of some of those experiences by saying like Latino is this one thing, you know. And so we really, you know, this is such a beautiful opportunity, especially with it being national in scope and with the concept of museum being so broad and open to how communities have conceived it. I think it's a real opportunity to not just center the Latino culture, but the Latino cultures, right? And what that looks like in different parts of the country. And that's really important because I do feel like I know a lot of other communities feel that are, even in my time in this country, right? Like there's a feeling of conditionality to Latinos being in or out, right? Like, are we American? Are we not? Okay, now that there's this anti-immigrant wave, then like now we want to downplay what is Latino, but other times we want to center it. And it feels, and I think something like museums give a sense of, you know, even if it's not four walls, right? But it gives a sense of stability, of this is something that that is real, that we recognize, that we celebrate. And that feeds into so many other aspects beyond the arts, you know, just to know that we talk so much about why representation matters in leaders, but representation matters in structures and in the built environment and in the cultural environment as well. And so I think that can really feed into just like the stability of our community, but also the investment in our community so that we can continue to thrive and contribute.
Completely agree, and thank you so much for sharing. Earlier in my broad overview of describing the project, I talked about the many roles that Latino cultural institutes and museums play for our communities here in the United States. They serve as spaces to educate, to entertain, to bring communities together. Laura, for you, what are the unique roles that Latino museums and cultural institutes play in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think just building on Celina, what you were saying, you know, and this is true for all types of cultural institutions, you know, that's from theaters to ballet and museums, is that people go not just to enjoy, but as an investment in themselves and in their families. So it builds social capital, right? What we watch is valued, what we're presented with is valued. You know, there is value that comes with the effort to engage us in culture. And so for, I think what I have been hearing and that I like a lot as first voice museums, right? First voice institutions have been places to validate our existence and our experiences and our stories, right? And whether that's through visual arts like painting and installations and sculptures to performance and music, Latino-focused cultural organizations have always been a place that says, here we are, and look what we do, and look what we've experienced, and look what we're worth. And so, the creation of the National Museum and then this program as a part of it at IMLS also says, well, this is also worth investing in. This is worth preserving and investing in as a country, because it's an important part of who we are as a country. And so I think that message, for me, it's always about a message of values. I'm into museums because I think they are temples to ourselves. The best ones, I think, can be temples to ourselves. And then when they're come from community momentum, well, that makes them more precious,
I really like that description, that they're a temple of ourselves. And as someone who started going to museums later in my adult life, I really value them, and I really see them as spaces where our our resiliency is presented, and our contributions, and our stories. And I don't know, I'm really excited to see where IMLS goes. So thank you so much for sharing. Oh, I'm sorry, you're off mute. I don't know.
I was going to say, I think Patricia was going to jump in too.
Go ahead, Patricia.
It's a way, and Laura, I think you said it at the beginning, but it's not only or somebody said it, it's celebration, but it's also that sense of belonging. You belong. It's not just that you're an addition. You're an essential part. And when if we get this thing to change it's a mindset also. I think, Laura, you were talking about something about, it's like a way of, you said divergent thinkers, or no, you didn't say divergent thinkers, but you were talking about a linear thinking way. And it's a way of representing the way we think also. It's our culture, but our culture, it's like how we think and how we express ourselves. So having that opportunity, and what Selena was saying, that equitable, and not it's like, and the outcomes that we can get from there, I think it's like critical too. So thank you, IMLS, and everybody that will support, any effort that has to do with having the opportunity to show and to belong, to have a place where it's mine. I'll go, I'll feel comfortable.
Thank you both for sharing your perspectives with us. I want to pause for a second to remind the audience to send their questions in the Q&A box. We are soon going to move into that portion of our program, and our team is reviewing these questions for us. So we would love to receive them and have our panelists respond to them. Luisa, on to you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Laura, you mentioned that museums and art more generally build social capitals. They are places that allow us Latinos to say, here we are, look at us, this is what we do, right? And Patricia also talked about creating a sense of belonging through these spaces. Selena uplifted how it's important to think about the outcomes of these spaces and how they really build equity. So I want us to push a little bit more on this idea of equity and the importance of cultural institutions and Latino museums as spaces of equity. So I'd love to ask you, Selena, in your opinion, in what ways can Latino museums catalyze or advance equity more specifically?
I mean, I think that there's the value of not just their existence, but what they're displaying, like what experiences are highlighted, and making sure that there's diversity in that, and diversity in terms of the types of experiences. I've seen museums at their best also be a space for discussing a documentary about what the femicide in Mexico, for example, or, you know, like places that can bring current issues within this, as Patricia mentioned, like the safe space where you feel like you belong to have more dynamic conversations based on what's happening in the world. And also to share, you know, different, like we've had philanthropy, organized conversations about like the state of people of color in Boston, and that was something that was hosted by a museum, you know, so something that can bring together different types of thinkers, but with a focus on a community. So I think that I see it at the importance of sort of convening and giving legitimacy to the past, the present, and the future. And I think museums can really have a unique ability to play into that role. And I always love, which I don't see enough of, but when you bring, you know, you think of the field trips and the buses lining outside of the museums, but also bringing some of the artists and the experts from the museum into the schools and into different community spaces to kind of create those bridges. Because I so hear you, Sophia, that a lot of people don't grow up going to the museum of any kind, you know, and it can be intimidating. It can, you know, you're lucky in DC that it's free, but it's not free everywhere else. And, you know, so anyway, I just think it can be a real bridge to center our particular culture and experience, or cultures and experiences.
Absolutely. I love this idea that cultural spaces bring together different types of thinkers. And around this idea, I want to open a question for either Laura or Patricia. How can Latino museums and cultural spaces serve as spaces for civic engagement for our communities, in your opinion? Oh, Patricia, you're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry. I see, you know, if you think about civic engagement, and I started talking about, Laura was talking about social capital, I think there's something about civic capital. And I don't know if it exists or not. I haven't found a formal definition by any scholar. But anyway, it's that ability to have a public space where your voice is heard, where people are listening to you, you know, where you have a space, when you are an equal standing as anybody else. So at the end of the day, you know, it's about, for me, it's about cultural democracy. You know, it's that, and it's that participation on the making, on being about us, on trying to represent, but not only to represent, it's like, okay, here I'm giving you a little space and you are represented, you know, it's like, and one of you said it, you know, how do you make it relevant for me on the 21st century? You know, it's like, and to address this complexity. So I see them as civic spaces also as places of dialogue, you know. And as I said before, you put artwork or you put any collection and you have an ethnographic collection. Okay, why are they inside of that case? You know, let's have a conversation, you know, and when that dialogue, you know, if more people are facilitating dialogue, creating programs in museums that invite the different communities, and the museum people leave EA, you know, get away from the museum and into the communities. I think that that's when that civic engagement happens, because it's more an equitable relationship also. It's not I'm coming to give you something, you know. It's I think, you know, and for me, the way of encouraging this civic engagement and civic model is through collaborations. You know, it has to start from a collaboration standpoint. And that's what the equity part comes in. You know, when you have a healthy collaboration, it's like people all bring together something through a co-creative process. You know, it's not owned by one person. It's like, and the more people who have engaged, the more commitment and compromise, and you want to do good. So
definitely,
and
co-creation is so important. Oh, sorry, Laura, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just jump in also around civic engagement, that so many of these spaces, of all kinds of art spaces, the majority in this country, I think people don't really understand that. It's not just Latino museums and Latino cultural centers, but most cultural and art-focused spaces start with volunteer work. They start with community effort, and that is civic engagement. So I think when we broaden our definition of civic engagement, we hope we get to the kind of policy, informed policy engagement that public we think about in public service, but all of the people hours it takes to keep a cultural center going, or the after school ballet folklorico program going, the amount of parent power, the amount of community power that takes is civic contribution, and again, I think that's probably outside vocabulary, but thinking about this as an opportunity to also recognize it. We recognize the amount of civic engagement. Sophia, I think when you were giving the overview of 270 institutions, so you think about that's thousands of people already. That's thousands of people, probably tens of thousands of people already providing civic service to drive this work. And we always think about what we consume, the program, the art that we see, the services, but the number of people it takes and how many of them are doing it out of passion, I think is pretty amazing. So that's what I think about in that civic engagement, and if we can put a name to it, and how much does it lift us up?
And it's a collaborative process, and the moment it's collaborative, it becomes like, everybody wins, I would think, if it's a reasonable one, but it's like, at the end of the day, it's well-being for everybody, and it's like, the more we know about each other, I think the more understanding and less clashing.
Absolutely, I completely agree. The people hours, the critical engagement that is so crucial to bringing these spaces to life is so important. And we often don't think about it as users of these spaces, and it's so important to uplift. So I really appreciate you doing that for us today. We will now turn to our Q&A portion of the event. We have received a lot of fantastic questions. I will do my best to go through as many as possible. And I would love to start asking Patricia, but I think any of you can jump in as well. The question says, I noticed the panel is all women. Can you speak about how men are represented in Latino museums as well? Is it equal?
What a question. Well, it's very interesting, because what Laura was saying of community efforts also, many times women in Latino cultures are many times the drivers of those community. I don't want to leave men aside, but there's a lot of, Laura saying, oh, I was looking at my mother teach, it's like the learning, there's a lot of that female role, I think. And I know there's lots of men in.
Oops, it seems there was a little bit of a freeze. So maybe while Patricia comes back, I don't know if Laura or Selena, you wanted to say something about this.
I think maybe I can pick up her sentence. We have very good representation. I would say there are many men in leadership of current Latino museums, very well noted Latino museums, artists, etc. Overall, the arts and culture community is primarily driven by women. That's what our demographics tell us. But I think it's really important to think about it as a space where there's a real possibility for equity. Because again, culture is a human production. And I think because, especially in our first voice, Latino institutions, it has to be so community driven. We see a lot of family engagement and real equitable engagement. I think all the gender things that are in play in all the spaces still exist, but there's opportunity to be models here.
I really like this idea of being a model, because I think a lot of, children, they really look up and they really get inspired by seeing people similar to them, right, in these spaces. And I just love that comment. Selena, were you going to say something? I thought you were moving, but if not, that's totally okay.
No, I shifted, but it's funny because I'm not in the formal. I haven't been yet, but life always has a way of giving you new experiences. I've never worked in a cultural institution but I did, I took art history, and I will not tell you what decade it was, many decades ago, just as a course. I didn't do a major, but definitely what was centered as art was definitely European and male driven. So I kind of love this question, that this is like the current interpretation of who's driving culture and art, because I think formally that's not what I was taught, in the US. And so I think that it is great that we're at a moment where women can be more in the leadership and driving these conversations along with men. But it wasn't my experience. And even to the extent that Latin American artists were highlighted, not so much like Latinos in the US, but Latin American, it was like you'd learn about Diego and the murals, and then at the end they'd be like, and Frida too. Now we're very Frida centric, but not when I was growing up. And so I think that it's a dynamic conversation, and I think there's space for us all to be leaders and advocates in this space.
Absolutely. I see Patricia is back, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe continue your thought.
If I remember. I'm sorry. We have a storm here and I lost internet, so I'm on my phone now. So where were we?
We were talking about female, male representation in the space.
Female and male representation. Well, there's also something to be said about, I would say, salaries, wages, museums. Like I've seen so many young people get into the museum field and then they're gone. And it is also a matter of, it's hard to have a job sometimes in a museum because of that. So I think that has been perhaps a determinant on the reason why sometimes you see more women, like this panel is all women. But I do think that there's also, there's wonderful men in leadership positions. So it might be a cultural thing.
Absolutely interesting. All right, so I would like to move on to the next question from the audience. This may be directed to Selena and Laura, but again, Patricia, feel free to answer. In your individual capacities, how have you seen your perspective in the administration of your duties accepted and maybe reflected in your missions?
I can keep it short, Selena, or you want to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think for me, it's been about lived experience, bringing lived experience to these positions of power and influence. Right now, as a leader in the federal government and a grant-making organization, I was a grantee. I've been a reader. We've been at small organizations and advocating, and so I feel like not being a part of the system and getting into the system with that lived experience has been very important.
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm now at a research institution, and have spent most of my career in state and local government, along with advocacy organizations. And I think that, you know, I think that there's a lot of value to just to pick up on what Laura said on lived experience, but also experience having worked with the communities or with the stakeholders or with the systems that we're trying to inform as researchers and advisors to both government and non-government actors. And so I think that there's, you know, for me, it's hard to disentangle how much of that is, you know, my experience in the work, or my experience being a Latina in the work, or my experience being a Latina, you know, like but I do feel like those are all important to, you know, my institutional role, and I think has been throughout my career. But I think it's also important to the point of that we started with earlier in the conversation, that I'm always really clear of, like, I can speak for myself, what I've learned, what I've experienced. I have, from the beginning, I think I really think it's because it's in my blood, but because of how I was raised and where I was raised, seen my struggle as interconnected with the struggles of others. But I try to be really careful to not speak for others and speak to the experiences of other communities. And so I try to be in solidarity, but also know that, you know, my lens only goes as far, you know, so far. And so I think for it's important what each of us brings, but also like how we engage with other people to round out, you know, to make sure that we're truly representing the communities we are working with.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to think of our own, you know, role when we are in these spaces, and what we can bring and how we can uplift other voices as well. Before we finish, there's a really interesting question that came in that I would like to open to the panel. What advocacy strategies and or resources can the panel share to promote inclusivity and celebration of all identities within Latinx cultures in predominantly white institutions? Maybe we can start with you, Laura, and then we can move on to other answers.
Sure. Advocacy strategies. I think messaging is really important. And within at least the cultural community, I'll speak as a very museum-y type person, and a funder, that it's very important and for predominantly white institutions, or what we think of as, you know, traditional museums, not Latino focused museums. You don't have to tell the whole story. We don't put that pressure on any other kind of exhibition. It can be a nuanced and narrow story. It just has to be well done, just like any other exhibition. So there's some paralysis, I think, when selling an idea, when it's new content. But you know, that's a form of resistance. And I think to resist back is understanding that good practice is good practice and ends in good content and good exhibitions. And not everybody has to like it. That's okay. Sometimes the best exhibitions and the most important ones have been ones that are intensely uncomfortable. That's part of our work. Patricia?
You know, but as a museum and as a group, as a community, I think we also need to create the space that conversations, you know, if it's uncomfortable, the conversation has to happen. And it has to happen, you know, even ahead of time, you know, working with the community that's in your landscape or in your environment, and doing that work together. I think that that's what makes it. So it's the exhibition, it's the programming, it's the other story, it's the community-based curation perhaps model that's, so equal voices, and you can start small and then go bigger, but it's and collaboration for sure.
Selena, do you want to say one last comment on this?
One quick resource I wanted to point people to: if you visit our website, urban.org, we have an incredible community engagement resource center, and they've developed some great toolkits on how to, it's not just about engaging community, but how to design with community. For, there's the research space, but it applies to a lot of different practical spaces as well. So I hope you can all check that out.
Great point. Well, it seems that we have unfortunately run out of time. I want to take a moment to thank our fantastic panelists for such a stimulating conversation. For the public, thank you so much for great questions. I wish we had the time to go through all of them. You may access the recording on our website. And I just want to wish everyone a fantastic holiday season. Again, thank you so much, and goodbye, and have a wonderful rest of your days.
Thank you.